The December Diner Disappearance. A Miss Marple. Mystery, Chapter 1. The December afternoon was damp, as if the sky itself had become weary of the year's end. Low-hanging clouds threatened snow, but the village of St. Mary Mead, with its quaint streets and ivy-clad cottages, remained blissfully untouched by the winter chill. Inside the village's only diner, the clatter of teacups, the hum of quiet conversation, and the comforting scent of roast chicken and freshly baked bread filled the air. It was a place that on most days offered sanctuary from the world's bustle, a rare stillness before the storm that would soon come. Miss Jane Marple sat in the corner, her favourite spot by the window. The warmth from the fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a gentle glow on the village outside. She had arrived early, as was her habit, to watch the coming and going of the local crowd, her sharp eyes scanning each face for the slightest shift in emotion. There was a comfort in these little rituals, and though she never spoke of it, Miss Marple felt a deep satisfaction in simply observing. Today, however, her peace was interrupted by a rare occurrence. Mrs. Clara Henshaw, the widow of the local butcher, entered the diner with a nervous energy that was impossible to ignore. She was a regular here, known for her quiet manner and deep involvement in the village's charitable works. But today, her usual composure was rattled, her hands twitching at the hem of her coat, as if she couldn't quite decide whether to pull it tighter or let it hang loosely. Her eyes darted quickly around the room, and when they landed on Miss Marple, they locked with a brief flash of recognition. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Henshaw greeted her, her voice warmer than usual, but edged with an unfamiliar unease. She placed her purse on the table and slid into the seat opposite the elderly woman, who only nodded in return. "Afternoon, Mrs. Henshaw," Miss Marple said, her voice soft, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. "What brings you in today, my dear?" The widow hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before leaning forward slightly, lowering her voice. "Something's happened, Miss Marple. Something dreadful." She paused, as though weighing her next words carefully. "Have you heard about the disappearance of Mr. Dawson?" Miss Marple tilted her head, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her teacup. "Mr. Dawson? The man from the post office, I presume?" Mrs. Henshaw nodded quickly, her nervous energy palpable. "Yes, that's him. He was supposed to meet with a business associate this morning, but he never showed up. Not a sign of him anywhere. His office is locked, and there's no trace of him at home either." She glanced out the window, as if checking to ensure no one was listening. "The whole village is talking about it, of course, but no one knows what to think. His disappearance, it's not like him." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, but her expression remained serene. "I see," she murmured, her voice thoughtful. "And I suppose the police are involved now?" Mrs. Henshaw's lips pressed into a thin line, and she gave a small shake of her head. "Not officially. Not yet, at least. But people are starting to whisper. I think they're afraid it's something more than a simple missing person case." Miss Marple's fingers twitched ever so slightly around her teacup. There was something about Mrs. Henshaw's tone that suggested more than mere concern. There was an underlying strain. "More than a simple case, you say? What do you mean by that?" The widow hesitated once more, the words seemingly difficult to form. Finally, she let out a long sigh and leaned in, speaking in a hushed tone. "Well, you see, Miss Marple, there's been talk. Some people think—" She stopped, her voice dropping further. "Some people think it might be foul play." Miss Marple said nothing at first. Instead, she allowed a long, deliberate silence to fill the air. letting the weight of her gaze linger on Mrs. Henshaw. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm and measured. "Foul play, you say? But what could have happened to him? Did anyone see him last?" Mrs. Henshaw's fingers gripped her purse tighter. "Well, that's just it. No one saw him leave the post office, not even his own clerk. And no one seems to know anything about his plans for the day. He just vanished." There was something off about Mrs. Henshaw's sudden unease, something that tugged at Miss Marple's attention. In all her years of quietly observing human nature, Miss Marple had learned to notice the small inconsistencies, the fidgeting fingers, the darting eyes, the pauses where a person might otherwise continue talking without hesitation. Mrs. Henshaw's anxiety wasn't simply from the disappearance of Mr. Dawson. No, this felt personal, almost as though it were connected to something deeper. But Miss Marple didn't press her. She simply observed, letting Mrs. Henshaw speak her mind at her own pace. "And what do you think?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle, as though she were inquiring after the weather. "What do you believe happened?" Mrs. Henshaw hesitated for a moment, then shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I don't know, Miss Marple. I really don't. But there's something strange about it all. He had enemies, you know. He was a man of business, always wheeling and dealing with people, but there was something off about him. Some whispers, some rumours. I don't know how to explain it." She glanced around once more, her voice dropping further. "He was involved in something I don't think anyone knows about, but it's not the sort of thing you can just let go." Miss Marple took a slow sip of her tea, never breaking her gaze. She had heard many such murmurs in her time, half-truths, veiled accusations and suspicions born of little more than intuition. It was her job, after all, to sift through the ordinary and the extraordinary to find patterns where others saw only randomness. And something about Mrs. Henshaw's words, something about her very tone, was starting to form the first threads of a mystery. "Well, Mrs. Henshaw," Miss Marple said, setting her cup down with a soft clink, "I think we shall have to see what comes of it. But I do hope you'll let me know if you hear any more." Mrs. Henshaw nodded quickly, her hands still fidgeting nervously. "Of course, I will. I will let you know." As the widow hurried out of the diner, Miss Marple remained seated, her mind already turning over the puzzle pieces. A missing man, whispered rumours, and a village that had been too quiet for far too long. The truth, she knew, would not remain hidden for long. And in this village, truth had a peculiar way of coming to light just when least expected. Chapter 2. The next morning, Miss Marple was once again seated in her favourite corner of the village diner. The warm glow of the fire flickered softly, though the chill from the night before still clung to the air. A heavy mist rolled in from the nearby woods, turning the once crisp morning into a damp grey stretch of indecision, like the atmosphere of the village itself. St. Mary Mead seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to break. Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the familiar faces of the villagers, going about their routine in the cosy establishment. She had learned to read people here, their body language as much an indicator of their thoughts as their words. But today, it was harder than usual to ignore the undercurrent of tension that had replaced the easy chatter and laughter of the usual crowd. They spoke in hushed tones now, glances darting nervously toward the door whenever a new face entered. The disappearance of Mr. Dawson had unsettled the village more than anyone had anticipated. As Miss Marple sipped her tea, she allowed her eyes to move across the room with casual, practiced ease. Her attention was caught by the entrance of an unusual figure, a tall, gaunt man with an air of self-importance. He walked briskly, his shoes tapping sharply against the wooden floor. It was none other than Reginald Bristow, the local solicitor. Though his presence was not out of the ordinary, there was something about his manner that was. Bristow was a man used to being in control, but today he seemed to carry an extra weight, one that, much like the fog outside, was not immediately visible, but unmistakable once noticed. He caught Miss Marple's eye and paused for a moment, a fleeting look of hesitation crossing his face before he steeled himself and moved toward her. Miss Marple gave him a small, polite nod, setting down her teacup as he approached. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with a strange smile, the lines on his face deepening as he spoke. "I trust you are well this morning." "I am, thank you," Miss Marple replied, offering him a welcoming smile. "And yourself, Mr. Bristow? You seem preoccupied this morning." Bristow's lips tightened for a moment before he took a seat opposite her, leaning in slightly as though there was something he needed to impart. "You've heard about Dawson, I'm sure?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her voice still calm. "The whole village is talking about it. It's not the sort of thing one easily forgets." Bristow shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. "There are certain things one doesn't discuss openly, Miss Marple, but I think you're someone who knows more than most." Miss Marple said nothing, merely raising an eyebrow in a manner that invited him to continue without a word. Bristow sighed, his gaze darting about the room. Dawson was involved in something that some might consider less than lawful. His business dealings, well, they've not always been above board. And there are people, let's say people of questionable character, who might have had a vested interest in him disappearing. He paused, catching his breath. "But that's all speculation, of course." "Speculation is a dangerous thing, Mr. Bristow," Miss Marple observed, her tone mild but pointed. "It can cloud the truth." Bristow gave a sharp nod. Yes, of course. But there's more to this than meets the eye. Dawson didn't just disappear. He was involved with some very unsavory individuals, Miss Marple. And now, his office is locked up tight. No one can get in, and none of his associates seem to know where he is. It's as if he vanished from the face of the earth. Miss Marple observed Bristow closely, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "That is indeed curious. But you must forgive me, Mr. Bristow. I'm curious about one thing. Why is it that you're so concerned? You hardly seem to be the type to worry over a local businessman's disappearance." For a moment, Bristow's face hardened, his lips pressing together in a thin line. He quickly masked his reaction with another practiced smile. "Oh, Miss Marple, I am concerned for the good of the village. If Dawson's disappearance is linked to anything more sinister, it could bring trouble to us all." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "You seem very well informed about this. Trouble you speak of, Mr. Bristow. Perhaps you could share more of your thoughts on the matter." Bristow's eyes darted again, and for a moment Miss Marple could almost see the wheels turning in his mind, wondering if he had said too much. After a pause, he stood smoothing his coat and adjusting his tie with mechanical precision. "I believe I've said enough for now, Miss Marple," he said with a quick smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm sure you'll be able to piece together the rest. After all, you have a remarkable knack for seeing what others don't." He turned and made his way to the counter, where he briefly exchanged words with the diner's owner, Mr. Hopkins. Miss Marple watched him carefully, her gaze lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. Something about his departure struck her as hurried, as though he were trying to leave before something caught up with him. Before she could muse further on the matter, the bell above the door jingled once more, and in walked Sergeant Blunt, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across the threshold. He nodded to Miss Marple, a small smile of recognition crossing his face. "Morning, Miss Marple," he greeted her, taking a seat at the table. "It seems we have another bit of news for you." "Oh?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. "What news, Sergeant?" Blunt hesitated before speaking, his voice low. "Dawson's clerk, young Tim Briggs, has gone missing as well. No one's seen him since yesterday afternoon. And his desk, Miss Marple, well, there was something odd about it. The drawer was left open, and inside was a letter that was never sent." "How very peculiar," Miss Marple murmured, her mind already turning over the implications. "A missing clerk, a letter never posted. It seems we're on the brink of something larger than a simple disappearance, don't you think, Sergeant?" Blunt's eyes flickered, unsure of how much he should reveal. "We're not ruling anything out yet, but it's certainly troubling." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Yes, troubling indeed. But we mustn't jump to conclusions. It's far too early for that." As Sergeant Blunt moved to leave, Miss Marple stayed behind, her thoughts tangled in the web that was beginning to form. A missing man, a missing clerk, and now a letter that no one had seen fit to mail. And somewhere, tucked away between these fragments, was the key to everything. It was a matter of seeing the connections. Those quiet, invisible threads that could tie all of this together. The village may have been small, but its secrets were many, and Miss Marple had every intention of uncovering them. Chapter 3. The fog had thickened by the time Miss Marple arrived at the post office the next afternoon. The air was damp and cold, clinging to her woolen scarf as she walked through the village square. Her footsteps muffled by the soft grey blanket that had rolled in from the hills. St. Mary Mead, normally so bright and full of life, now seemed swallowed by the mist, its usual warmth obscured by the creeping chill. As she entered the post office, the soft jingle of the bell above the door seemed unusually loud, breaking the silence like a sharp, unwelcome intrusion. The small shop was quiet, the only sounds the rustle of papers and the shuffle of feet behind the counter. Miss Marple had always admired the post office for its simplicity and the familiar faces of its staff. But today something felt off, subtle but undeniable. The clerk, a young man named Tim Briggs, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, behind the counter stood Mrs. Wiley, the postmistress, her usually pleasant expression now strained. She glanced up as Miss Marple entered, and a flicker of recognition passed over her face. But it was quickly replaced by a guarded look. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Wiley greeted her with a polite nod. "What can I do for you today?" "I was hoping to speak with Tim Briggs," Miss Marple replied, offering a warm, albeit curious smile. "I hear he's been away for a day or two." Mrs. Wiley stiffened slightly, her hands folding over the counter. "Tim, yes, he's not been in. His absence is most unusual. I've tried reaching him, but there's been no word, not even a message." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her tone soft but probing. "That does seem curious. Have you any idea where he might be? It's not like him to leave without a word, is it?" Mrs. Wiley hesitated before answering, her eyes flicking toward the back of the shop as if to ensure no one was listening. "No, it's not like Tim at all. He's always been diligent, always here on time, but, well, There was something strange, Miss Marple. Her voice dropped lower, almost to a whisper. Just before he disappeared, he was acting odd, fidgety, looking over his shoulder all the time, almost as though he were being watched. Miss Marple nodded, absorbing the information with her usual calm demeanour. And did he mention anything? Did he have any concerns? Perhaps something unusual was going on with the post office, or maybe with Mr. Dawson. Mrs. Wiley's face tightened at the mention of Mr. Dawson. Well, I'm sure I don't know, Miss Marple. Tim didn't talk much about his work, but there were times when he would come in looking more than a little flustered. He'd be carrying papers, large, folded ones, looking around like he didn't want anyone to see. At first, I thought he was just nervous, but now— She trailed off, shaking her head. Miss Marple's mind raced as she pieced together the fragments. Tim's behaviour, his unease, the mysterious papers he seemed to be carrying, none of it felt coincidental. And then there was Dawson's disappearance. Was it possible that Tim had some connection to it, however indirect? The tension in the room thickened, as if the very walls themselves held secrets waiting to be uncovered. I see, Miss Marple said slowly, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Wiley's face. Perhaps you could tell me more about these papers. Do you remember seeing what was on them? Mrs. Wiley's expression faltered, and her hands fidgeted nervously. I don't know what was on them. It was hard to tell, Miss Marple. He was always so careful with them, as though they were important. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I'm just imagining things, but I thought I saw a name. She broke off, her voice trembling slightly, but I'm not sure. Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile, though inside her mind was already leaping ahead. A name? That was a clue, something small but important. Perhaps Mrs. Wiley had seen more than she realized. I understand, Miss Marple said gently, and I appreciate you telling me this. It's not easy to speak of such things, I'm sure. Mrs. Wiley nodded, visibly relieved to have shared her thoughts. Thank you, Miss Marple. I do hope Tim is all right. It's just not like him to disappear without a trace. Yes, Miss Marple replied, her tone turning thoughtful. It's certainly unlike him, but perhaps we'll uncover the reason soon enough. As Miss Marple made her way out of the post office, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial. Something hidden just beneath the surface of these casual conversations and odd behaviours. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but the image they formed remained clouded. Before she could walk far, she noticed a figure standing at the far edge of the village square. It was none other than Reginald Bristow, the solicitor, his back slightly hunched as if in deep thought. His face was drawn, and his eyes constantly shifted from side to side, as though he feared someone might be watching him. He caught sight of Miss Marple, and without breaking stride, moved quickly toward her, his demeanour far more hurried than usual. Miss Marple, he said, his voice low and tense, I was hoping to catch you before you left. Well, there's something you should know about Dawson. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. What is it, Mr. Bristow? Another secret to add to the list? Bristow's lips pressed into a thin line. It's not just Dawson. It's Briggs as well. Tim was involved in something that neither of us could have foreseen, but I think it's all connected. Dawson's disappearance, Tim's sudden leave of absence, and something I found in Dawson's office. It all points to one thing. Which is? Miss Marple asked, her gaze steady. Bristow hesitated, his eyes darting nervously around the square before he leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Blackmail. Dawson was being blackmailed, and I believe Briggs knew about it. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though she remained outwardly composed. Blackmail, she repeated softly. That's quite a serious accusation, Mr. Bristow. Do you have proof? Bristow's eyes darkened, his lips twitching into something resembling a grimace. Not yet, but I have a hunch that we're not dealing with an ordinary disappearance. And I think you're the only one who can get to the truth before it's too late. Miss Marple took a deep breath, her mind already assessing the new information. Blackmail, missing people, and a tangled web of secrets. It seemed that every day brought a new revelation, and yet the truth remained elusive. But Miss Marple was patient. The pieces, however scattered, would eventually fall into place. Very well, Mr. Bristow, she said, her voice calm but resolute. I'll look into it, but remember, the truth is often not as simple as it first appears. Bristow nodded, his shoulders stiff with a mixture of tension and hope. I know, Miss Marple. I'm counting on you. As he walked away, Miss Marple remained in the square for a moment, watching him disappear into the fog. The puzzle was becoming more intricate by the hour, and soon, very soon, the final piece would fall into place. Chapter 4. The fog that had descended upon St. Mary Mead in the past few days had not lifted, but rather thickened, shrouding the village in a silent, oppressive stillness. The streets, normally so full of life, felt hollow now. Even the most familiar faces seemed reluctant to engage in the usual chatter, their words muted as if they feared saying something that might expose a truth better left unspoken. Miss Marple's mind was a quiet whirl of thoughts as she sat by the hearth in the local vicarage, her tea now cold in the cup before her. The village had always been a place where small secrets festered beneath the surface, hidden by pleasantries and polite smiles. But the mystery of Dawson's disappearance had cut deeper than she had expected, unearthing tensions that no one had cared to acknowledge before. Her most recent conversation with Reginald Bristow had left her with more questions than answers. Blackmail, he had said. Dawson had been involved in something dangerous, something that had forced him into a position where he could be controlled. And now, with Tim Briggs also missing, the web of deceit seemed to stretch farther than Miss Marple had anticipated. She had decided to take a quiet walk that afternoon, hoping to gather her thoughts before visiting Dawson's office. There, she might uncover a clue that would bring everything into sharper focus. As she stepped out into the thickening mist, her eyes scanned the village, noting every detail. The seemingly ordinary events of the day, a dog barking, a cart rolling by, seemed charged with meaning now, as if they were all pieces of a puzzle she had yet to fully see. The post office was her first stop. It was, after all, the last place anyone had seen Tim Briggs. And there was something about Mrs. Wiley's discomfort that lingered in Miss Marple's mind. She had known people like her before, nervous, but not in the way most would expect. Mrs. Wiley was holding something back, and Miss Marple had no intention of letting her off the hook so easily. As she entered the small shop, the bell above the door jingled softly, and Miss Marple could already sense the change in the air. There was an unease here that hadn't been present before, a ripple of tension that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Mrs. Wiley was behind the counter, just as Miss Marple had expected, but her usual calm demeanour had been replaced by a quiet but palpable anxiety. She was wiping down the counter, but her movements were jerky, uneven. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Wiley," Miss Marple greeted her, her voice soft but clear. I was hoping to speak with you again about Tim." Mrs. Wiley looked up quickly, her hand pausing in mid-air before she dropped the cloth onto the counter. She managed a thin smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting you. Yes, I thought I might stop by," Miss Marple said with an easy smile, though her gaze never wavered. "You see, I've been thinking a great deal about Tim's disappearance, and I can't help but wonder if there's something more to it than simply his absence." Mrs. Wiley's face tightened, and for a moment Miss Marple could see her lips twitch, as though she were about to say something and then thought better of it. "I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple," she replied, her voice wavering ever so slightly. "Tim's a good lad, but people do go missing sometimes, don't they?" "People do," Miss Marple agreed, stepping closer, her eyes keenly studying Mrs. Wiley's every movement. "But in this case, there are certain things that don't quite add up. For instance, the papers he was carrying, do you remember them? The ones he seemed to be so careful with?" Mrs. Wiley's fingers tightened around the cloth in her hands, and her gaze shifted uneasily toward the back of the shop. I don't know what you're talking about," she muttered, her voice dropping lower. "You're making something out of nothing, Miss Marple." But Miss Marple wasn't fooled by the act. She had seen enough of human nature in her years of observation to know when someone was hiding something. Mrs. Wiley was trying too hard to appear calm, and the faint trembling of her hands betrayed her. "You don't have to tell me everything, Mrs. Wiley," Miss Marple said gently, her voice almost soothing. "But I do think you might want to reconsider how you handle this situation. If you know something, anything, it could help. Tim may be in danger, and there are people in this village who don't want the truth to come out." Mrs. Wiley's eyes flicked to the door, and she lowered her voice. "I don't know what you want from me, Miss Marple," she whispered, "but if you must know, Tim was in the office the morning before he disappeared. He was carrying a large folder of papers. He told me he was meeting with someone that afternoon. Someone important. He was so nervous, I thought he might be ill." "Did he say who he was meeting?" Miss Marple pressed, her tone mild but insistent. "No," Mrs. Wiley replied, her voice quivering. "He didn't say, but there was a name written on one of the papers I saw. I didn't look too closely, but it was familiar, very familiar." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. "And what was the name, Mrs. Wiley?" The postmistress hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously toward the back room once more. I don't think I should say, Miss Marple. I don't want to get anyone in trouble. It's none of my business." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "You've already said enough, Mrs. Wiley. The truth is rarely as simple as we want it to be, but it's always the best course. If you care for Tim at all, you'll help me understand what's going on. If you won't, then I will have to seek answers elsewhere." Mrs. Wiley looked stricken, as if the weight of the decision was too much for her to bear. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to come from deep within her chest, she whispered, "It was Bristow's name. Reginald Bristow. He was the one Tim was meeting." Miss Marple's thoughts froze for a moment. Bristow, the solicitor, the same man who had so casually mentioned blackmail the other day. The connection was undeniable. Bristow's name on that piece of paper, in the context of Tim's nervous behavior, it all pointed in one direction, though Miss Marple wasn't yet sure what that direction was. "Thank you, Mrs. Wiley," Miss Marple said softly, standing to leave. "You've been most helpful." As she stepped out of the post office and into the fog once more, Miss Marple's mind raced. Bristow, it seemed, had far more involvement in this mystery than he had let on. and somewhere in the tangled threads of his connection to Tim Briggs, the truth about Dawson's disappearance, and perhaps much more, was waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 5. The day had turned colder, the fog thicker, as if the village itself was wrapping itself in a blanket of uncertainty. Miss Marple walked slowly through the mist-covered streets, her mind still turning over the new revelation from Mrs. Wiley, the mention of Reginald Bristow's name. The solicitor, who had shown so much concern for the case, seemed to have far more at stake than anyone had realized. She couldn't help but feel the edges of the puzzle shifting, the pieces clicking together with a subtle but growing certainty. She had not yet gone to Dawson's office, though she had meant to. But now, with the mention of Bristow, she felt the need to gather one more piece of the puzzle first. And so, her feet led her to the small but cosy house on the edge of the village where Mrs. Henshaw lived. The widow had seemed so anxious during their last conversation, her eyes darting nervously at every mention of Dawson's disappearance. Miss Marple could not ignore the feeling that Mrs. Henshaw knew more than she had let on. Perhaps, she reasoned, if she spoke with her again, she could draw out something that would provide a clearer link between the solicitor, the missing clerk, and Dawson's vanishing act. When she arrived at Mrs. Henshaw's house, the door opened quickly, as if the widow had been expecting her. She looked tired, her usual composed demeanour replaced with a weariness that spoke of sleepless nights. Still, when she saw Miss Marple standing on her doorstep, her expression softened, and she stepped aside to invite her in. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Henshaw greeted her, her voice strained but warm. "I didn't expect you today. What brings you here?" Miss Marple offered a small smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Mrs. Henshaw. I just thought I might have another look at the situation. There are some details that don't quite make sense yet, and I believe you might hold a key piece of information." The widow hesitated, glancing toward the sitting room where a fire crackled softly in the hearth. She stepped aside, gesturing toward a chair. "Please, come in. I'll make some tea." As Miss Marple seated herself by the fire, she noticed the fine tremor in Mrs. Henshaw's hands as she moved about the room. She had not been this unsettled before. There was something more, something Miss Marple could not quite place. "How is it that you've been so involved with Mr. Dawson's disappearance?" Miss Marple asked casually, watching Mrs. Henshaw over the rim of her teacup. "You knew him, of course, but you didn't seem close. Why the sudden concern now?" Mrs. Henshaw's face tightened. She hesitated, as though considering how much to reveal. Finally, she sank into the chair opposite Miss Marple, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Dawson was a business acquaintance. We had dealings now and then, nothing of great consequence. But," she paused, her voice lowering, "there were some things I wish I had known sooner." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp yet gentle. "What things, Mrs. Henshaw? Anything you can recall now?" The widow took a slow breath. "A few months ago, Dawson asked me for a favour. He needed someone to help him with a letter he planned to send, but never did." She paused, her eyes darting to the side. "He was nervous about it. I never asked what it was about, but he told me it was something that could ruin him if it got out." Miss Marple's mind clicked into place, a small smile playing at the edges of her lips. A letter. Was this letter connected to any of his business dealings, perhaps? Something with Bristow, perhaps? Mrs. Henshaw's eyes widened slightly, and Miss Marple saw the subtle flush that spread across her cheeks. She was holding something back, something important. "I'm not sure, Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't know about Bristow, but I do remember Dawson mentioning something about people he didn't want to cross, people who had power over him. He was very afraid, Miss Marple, and the letter, I don't think it was meant for anyone else to see." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mind working through the possibilities. A letter, hidden for months, a man afraid for his life. It all pointed towards something far more complicated than a simple disappearance. And then there was Bristow, whose presence seemed to hover like a shadow over every part of the mystery. "Do you still have the letter, Mrs. Henshaw?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Henshaw's eyes flickered to the bookshelf on the far side of the room, a tense silence stretching between them. I don't know, Miss Marple. I haven't seen it in a long time, but I do remember Dawson saying that if anything were to happen to him, the letter would be the key. The letter, he said, would explain everything." "And you never thought to keep it?" Miss Marple asked, her tone a blend of curiosity and subtle reproach. The widow's face reddened. "I didn't think it would be necessary. I thought he was simply being paranoid. But now—" She trailed off, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I fear I've made a terrible mistake." Miss Marple stood and moved toward the bookshelf, her eyes scanning the rows of books until they settled on a small, inconspicuous box near the back. Mrs. Henshaw followed her gaze, her hands trembling. "Miss Marple, I'm not sure—" Miss Marple opened the box slowly, revealing a bundle of letters, old and yellowed with age. One of them, placed carefully at the top, was sealed with wax. It was unmistakably the letter Dawson had spoken of. "I believe this is the letter you were looking for," Miss Marple said softly, her fingers brushing against the edge of the envelope, "and I think it's about time we open it." Mrs. Henshaw looked as though she might protest, but then she nodded, her face pale. "I suppose you're right. If it's truly the key to all of this, then we have no choice but to face it." Miss Marple smiled gently, her expression calm, yet filled with the quiet certainty of someone who knew they were on the brink of an answer. "Indeed, let's see what secrets it holds." Chapter 6. The letter that Miss Marple had carefully unfolded was far from what she had expected. The parchment was old, the ink faded in places but still legible, and the handwriting, though neat, carried a certain urgency, an unmistakable tightness, as though the writer had been attempting to steady trembling hands. It had not been written with the ease of a casual note, but with the precision of someone who knew their words might be their last. Miss Marple sat back in the armchair, the letter held in her hands as she studied it. Mrs. Henshaw, seated across from her, had not spoken a word since the letter had been revealed. The widow's face was pale, her eyes fixed on the page as if expecting something dark to leap off the paper and reveal itself. For a long moment, Miss Marple simply read the letter, her eyes moving slowly over the words, letting them sink in, allowing their significance to unfold without haste. Finally, she exhaled softly, her gaze lifting to meet Mrs. Henshaw's. "Well," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but laden with an undeniable sense of realization, "it seems Dawson was right to be worried. This letter is not just a warning, it's a confession." Mrs. Henshaw looked bewildered, her voice barely a whisper. "A confession? What does it say?" Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, setting it back into its envelope. Dawson had been involved with individuals who were, shall we say, less than reputable. His business dealings were far riskier than anyone realized, and from the looks of this letter, he was being coerced into something darker. These individuals, as he calls them, were blackmailing him. They had information on him, something that could ruin him if it came to light. Mrs. Henshaw's hand went to her mouth, her eyes widening. But what was it, Miss Marple? What did he do that could cause such a scandal? Ah, Miss Marple said softly, almost to herself. This is where the letter gets interesting. Dawson doesn't outright say what the secret is, but it seems to involve someone close to him, someone he was desperate to protect. But the key here, she added, her eyes narrowing with the sharpness of a woman who had long learned to observe the smallest details, is that Dawson was prepared to go public with this secret. He was ready to expose everything to the police. Mrs. Henshaw's hand dropped to her lap, the shock still apparent on her face. But then, why would he disappear? If he had the courage to expose it, why not go ahead and do so? Miss Marple's gaze softened slightly. That, I think, is the crux of it. You see, while Dawson was prepared to expose the blackmail, he wasn't prepared for the consequences. And someone, likely the very people who were blackmailing him, must have learned of his intentions. Miss Marple paused, her lips pursing slightly as she turned the letter over in her hands. It's clear that Dawson didn't just vanish on his own accord. No, Mrs. Henshaw, he was taken. The widow's eyes filled with something between fear and disbelief. Taken, but by who? And why hasn't anyone found him? That is precisely what we need to uncover, Miss Marple replied, her tone growing more decisive. Dawson knew too much, and he was willing to reveal it all. He wasn't just a businessman caught up in something trivial. He was involved in something far more dangerous, something that people would kill to keep hidden. A long silence stretched between them as the weight of Miss Marple's words sank in. Mrs. Henshaw's hands were trembling again, and Miss Marple's mind was already turning, piecing together the threads of the mystery with deliberate care. Dawson must have been desperate to have written this letter and to leave it behind, Miss Marple continued. But what concerns me most, Mrs. Henshaw, is that someone close to him might have played a part in his disappearance. Someone who knew about this letter. Someone who had the most to lose if it were ever revealed. Reginald Bristow, Mrs. Henshaw whispered, the name escaping her lips almost without thought. It's him, isn't it? He's the one behind all of this. He's been acting strange for weeks, always so concerned, always trying to throw us off track. He must have been involved with Dawson somehow. He must have been the one blackmailing him. Miss Marple's eyes widened ever so slightly, the mention of Bristow striking a chord. You may be right, Mrs. Henshaw. It's possible that Bristow knew exactly what Dawson was planning, and it's even possible that he is the one who had Dawson removed from the picture. But I am not ready to make such an assumption just yet. But what else can it be, Miss Marple? Mrs. Henshaw insisted, her voice rising in agitation. Who else could have done it? Bristow has been at the centre of everything from the start. He was the one who warned me about Dawson's trouble. The one who seemed to know so much more than he was letting on. I know, Mrs. Henshaw, Miss Marple said, her voice soothing but firm. Bristow's behaviour is certainly suspect, but we must not forget that Dawson was involved with other people. People we don't yet know about. People who could have as much or more motive to silence him. Miss Marple rose from her seat, the quiet determination in her step unmistakable. I believe we are nearing the end of this mystery, Mrs. Henshaw, but there is still much we need to learn. Dawson's secret, the identity of his blackmailers, and the role that Bristow plays in all of this. I will visit Dawson's office next, and we will see what else we can uncover. Mrs. Henshaw stood as well, her face pale, but filled with a mix of fear and hope. "You believe we will find him? You believe we can solve this?" Miss Marple gave her a small, reassuring smile. "I always find the truth, Mrs. Henshaw. It may take time, but in the end, everything that is hidden must come to light." As Miss Marple left the widow's house, her thoughts were already on the next step in her investigation. Dawson's office. There, she was certain, lay the next piece of the puzzle. The letter had revealed much, but not enough. Not yet. The web was becoming clearer, but its strands were still tangled, and Miss Marple had every intention of untangling them all. Chapter 7. The morning had grown crisp and clear by the time Miss Marple made her way toward Dawson's office. The fog had finally lifted, though the village still seemed on edge, as if holding its breath. The soft chatter of the villagers had quieted, and even the birds seemed to have retreated to more sheltered places. There was an unease in the air, a quiet anticipation, as though the village knew that something important was about to be revealed. Dawson's office, a small but functional building tucked away on the edge of the village square, had always been unassuming. From the outside, it looked like just another building, its windows small and practical, with a brass nameplate above the door that read simply, "Dawson and Cubshus, Solicitors." It was the kind of place where nothing much ever seemed to happen, a place where business proceeded as usual, until now. Miss Marple stood for a moment before the door, her hand resting lightly on the brass handle. Her mind was still turning over the contents of the letter she had read at Mrs. Henshaw's house, and the more she thought about it, the clearer the picture became. Dawson had been involved in something much larger than anyone had known, a secret so powerful that it had driven him to prepare for his own exposure, to leave behind a clue for someone to find. And now it was time to uncover the rest. She pushed open the door, which creaked on its hinges, the sound echoing in the stillness. Inside, the office was dim but tidy. A large oak desk sat in the center of the room, papers neatly stacked, some with handwritten notes, others with official stamps. There was a faint smell of dust in the air, mingling with the faint, sharp scent of ink. Nothing about the room suggested urgency, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances. Dawson had been careful, too careful, and she suspected he had hidden something here that could reveal everything. As she moved to the desk, her eyes swept across the room, noting the small details. A ledger on the side table, a chair slightly askew, a faint trace of ink on the edge of the desk, signs that someone had been here recently, though not within the last day or two. Whoever had taken Dawson, they had been thorough, making sure nothing seemed out of place. Miss Marple's gaze finally settled on the bottom drawer of the desk. It was slightly open, as though someone had been in a hurry, but had not quite finished their search. Her fingers brushed lightly against the wood, and then she pulled it open, careful not to disturb anything unnecessarily. Inside, the drawer contained a few sheets of paper and a small box. The papers were nothing of interest, just old correspondence. But the box caught her attention. It was small and wooden, with a faded brass clasp. Miss Marple picked it up carefully, turning it over in her hands. The box seemed unremarkable, but something about it felt important. There was no key in sight, but she didn't need one. With a small twist of her wrist, the clasp clicked open. Inside the box was a single folded sheet of paper, much like the letter Dawson had left behind. Miss Marple unfolded it slowly, her heart picking up its pace as she read the few short lines written in Dawson's familiar hand. To whom it may concern, if this letter is found, I fear I will not be returning. There are those who would stop at nothing to prevent the truth from coming out. What I have learned, and what I intend to reveal, is more dangerous than anyone could imagine. The key to understanding what has happened lies with Bristow. But beware, he will stop at nothing to protect himself. If you have the courage to uncover the truth, follow the trail I've left behind. It will lead you to him. Do not trust anyone. They are all involved. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the final sentence for a moment, her mind racing with the implications. Bristow. Once again his name appeared in connection with Dawson's disappearance. And now, it seemed, Dawson had left her with the final clue, the key to unravelling the entire mystery. But what exactly did it mean? Bristow was the key, but why had Dawson trusted Miss Marple with this knowledge? There was still so much she didn't understand, so many pieces that hadn't yet fallen into a place. Miss Marple closed the box with a quiet click, her mind already working through the new information. She tucked the box into the folds of her coat and began to make her way to the door. But as she reached for the handle, she froze. The sound of footsteps outside had caught her attention. Slowly, Miss Marple turned, her heart skipping a beat as the door opened to reveal none other than Reginald Bristow. "Miss Marple," Bristow greeted her with a forced smile, his eyes glancing around the room quickly, though his posture remained stiff. "I was hoping to catch you here." Miss Marple's gaze was steady, though her pulse quickened. She had expected him to show up sooner or later, but the fact that he had arrived just as she was about to leave felt more than coincidental. "Mr. Bristow," Miss Marple replied smoothly, her voice calm but edged with a quiet, perceptive strength. "I was just finishing up here. I trust you have something to add to this puzzle." Bristow stepped further into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. His eyes lingered on the desk for a moment before he focused back on Miss Marple. "I believe you're getting closer to the truth, Miss Marple," he said carefully, his words measured. "But you should know that some truths are better left buried." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her expression calm but unyielding. "Is that so, Mr. Bristow? And what, may I ask, do you have to hide?" Bristow's smile faltered, but he quickly masked it, adopting his usual composure. "I have nothing to hide, Miss Marple. I simply believe you're making a mistake, and I don't want you to get in over your head." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her voice softening. "Oh, I don't believe I'm making a mistake, Mr. Bristow. But I do believe you know far more than you're letting on." There was a brief, tense silence before Bristow's smile returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We shall see, Miss Marple. We shall see." As he turned to leave, Miss Marple stood there, her thoughts racing. Bristow was hiding something, that much was clear. And whatever it was, it had to be the key to the entire mystery. The game was afoot, and Miss Marple was more determined than ever to solve it. Chapter 8. The day grew colder as Miss Marple made her way through the village square, the wind biting at her cheeks as it swept through the narrow streets. Though the fog had lifted, a sense of lingering tension remained in the air, an unease that seemed to have settled over the entire village. The more Miss Marple uncovered, the deeper the mystery became, and the more complex the motives of the people involved appeared. As she walked, her mind turned over the conversation with Reginald Bristow. His visit to Dawson's office had been more than a simple coincidence. He had known she was there. She had no doubt of it. But what had been his true purpose? Was he trying to intimidate her? Or was he genuinely trying to warn her off the trail? Whatever the case, Miss Marple knew one thing for sure. Bristow was hiding something, and the time had come to unearth it. Her steps carried her toward the village's small library, a place that had long been a quiet haven for her. She had visited it many times before, often to check in on the most recent books, but today it would serve a more important purpose. She needed to find out more about Dawson, more about his connections, and more about the people who had been around him. The library was quiet when she arrived. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Carter, was seated at the front desk, scribbling notes in a ledger. At the sight of Miss Marple, Mrs. Carter smiled warmly, though there was a certain caution in her eyes, as though she too had sensed the growing unrest in the village. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you," Mrs. Carter said, setting her pen aside. "Is there anything I can help you with today?" "I do believe you may have something that could be of assistance," Miss Marple replied, her voice steady. "I'm looking for information on a man named Reginald Bristow. He seems to have had a considerable influence in this village, and I'd like to understand his background a bit more." Mrs. Carter's eyebrows raised slightly, though her expression remained polite. "Reginald Bristow, you say? Well, I can't say I know much about him beyond what anyone else knows. He's always been involved in village matters, though he tends to keep to himself. But I do recall that he was quite active in some of the town's affairs a few years ago, particularly with land disputes, I believe." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts already racing. Land disputes, of course. That could be a starting point. "Do you happen to have any records on those disputes? Perhaps some of the older files might shed light on Bristow's dealings." "Of course," Mrs. Carter said, standing up with a creak of her chair. "Let me fetch the files for you. It's been some time since they were last looked at, but I'm sure we have them somewhere." As the librarian disappeared into the back room, Miss Marple glanced around the library. Her gaze fell on a shelf of old, dusty volumes. One of them caught her eye, a thick book titled St. Mary Mead, A History of Its People and Their Secrets. It seemed an odd title for a history book, but then again, Miss Marple had learned over the years that the most unassuming books often hid the most valuable information. She walked over and pulled it from the shelf, opening it to the first page. The book was filled with sketches and stories of the village's founding families, but as she flipped through the pages, one name stood out: the Bristow family. There was little written about them, but a mention of an old family dispute caught Miss Marple's attention. Reginald Bristow's great-grandfather was involved in a controversial land transaction with a local businessman, Miss Marple read aloud to herself. The transaction had resulted in a bitter rivalry, one that left a lasting stain on the Bristow family's reputation. Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. The Bristow family's history with land deals had clearly shaped Reginald's career, perhaps even his dealings with Dawson. It seemed Bristow had been raised in an atmosphere of secrecy and competition, one where ruthless business tactics were the norm. Before Miss Marple could continue her thoughts, Mrs. Carter returned with a stack of files. She handed them to Miss Marple, who thanked her quietly and began to sift through the papers. The files contained records of various land disputes, some settled amicably, others with more shady undertones. One file, however, caught her eye immediately. It was labelled Bristow versus Dawson. Miss Marple's fingers hesitated on the edge of the folder. She pulled it open and began to read through the pages, her heart quickening as she pieced together the story. It seemed that several years ago, Reginald Bristow had been involved in a legal dispute with Dawson over the sale of a large tract of land. The deal had gone sour, with accusations of fraud on both sides. The conflict had been settled out of court, but it had left both men with lingering bitterness. As Miss Marple read the final notes of the file, one sentence jumped out at her. Dawson suspected Bristow was blackmailing him over the land deal, though no concrete evidence was found. A small smile tugged at Miss Marple's lips. So, Dawson had been aware of Bristow's underhanded tactics after all. This was a crucial piece of information, one that suggested Dawson had been prepared to expose Bristow. And now, it seemed, Bristow had taken matters into his own hands. Just as Miss Marple was about to leave the library, her thoughts racing with the new information, she was stopped by a familiar voice. "Miss Marple, I wonder if I might have a word." She turned to find Sergeant Blunt standing in the doorway, his face more serious than usual. "Of course, Sergeant. What brings you here today?" "I've been looking into Dawson's case further," Blunt said, his voice low. "There's something we've just uncovered, something that connects Dawson's disappearance to a recent crime in the area. A robbery, to be specific, but I think you'll find it's no ordinary theft." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "A robbery, you say? How very intriguing." Blunt stepped closer, glancing around before speaking in a hushed tone. "It appears that Dawson was involved with some very dangerous individuals. We found evidence that he was meeting with someone shortly before his disappearance, someone who was seen entering the same place where the robbery took place." "Who was it?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but intent. Blunt hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "We're still investigating, but I have a suspicion that this robbery is connected to something much bigger, a final piece in a puzzle that might just involve more people than we thought." Miss Marple's mind raced, the implications of Blunt's words spinning into a clearer picture. Dawson's disappearance, the blackmail, the robbery, everything was starting to come together. But there was still one crucial question that remained. Who was pulling the strings behind it all? Chapter 9. The village of St. Mary Mead had returned to its usual rhythm by the time Miss Marple made her way back to the square the following afternoon. The fog had lifted, but its absence only seemed to underscore the quiet tension that now lingered between the rows of cottages. The more she uncovered, the more the village's quaint exterior seemed to crumble, revealing the darker undercurrents that had always been there, hidden in plain sight. As Miss Marple passed the familiar buildings, Mrs. Henshaw's butcher shop, the post office, the vicarage, her mind was focused on the latest revelation. Dawson's connections to dangerous individuals and the robbery that Sergeant Blunt had uncovered. Everything was pointing in one direction, but the final piece remained elusive. Who was truly behind Dawson's disappearance? And why had Bristow, who had long been suspected of foul play, become even more entwined in the mystery? She paused by the village pond, taking a moment to collect her thoughts. The answers she knew were all there, just waiting to be discovered. But they would not be found through a simple conversation or a quick search. The truth, as always, lay buried beneath layers of deception, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that only patience and careful observation would reveal it. Her musings were interrupted by a sudden voice from behind her. "Miss Marple, I've been looking for you." She turned to find Sergeant Blunt hurrying toward her, his face drawn with a mixture of urgency and concern. Miss Marple gave him a small, welcoming smile, though her eyes were keen with curiosity. "Sergeant Blunt, what brings you here today?" she asked, her voice calm but perceptive. Blunt paused before her, glancing around as if making sure no one was listening. "I've got something new," he said quietly, his tone serious. something that ties everything together. We've been investigating that robbery I mentioned, and we found something in the stolen goods that," he paused, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "It links directly back to Bristow." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. "Bristow, you say? How interesting! And what exactly did you find?" Blunt hesitated for a moment, then handed her a small bundle wrapped in plain brown paper. "I think you should take a look for yourself." Miss Marple unwrapped the package carefully, her fingers brushing over the edges as she opened it to reveal a series of documents. The papers were official-looking, some stamped with legal seals, others hastily written in ink. She skimmed through the papers quickly, her eyes narrowing as she saw a familiar name once again. "These are legal documents," she murmured, "but not just any legal documents. These are contracts, land deals, and financial agreements, all involving Bristow and Dawson." Blunt nodded gravely. "Exactly. Among the items stolen during the robbery was a box containing these papers, and one of them, the most recent, was signed just a few days before Dawson disappeared. It looks like Dawson was trying to reverse some of his earlier dealings with Bristow." Miss Marple's thoughts raced as she pieced the puzzle together. So Dawson was making moves to extricate himself from Bristow's influence. It seems Bristow had more to lose than anyone realized. "That's right," Blunt confirmed, his brow furrowed. "It seems Dawson was preparing to expose something, perhaps not just about the land deal, but about Bristow's other dealings as well. And we believe Bristow found out that Dawson was planning to turn these documents over to the authorities. That's when things started to get dangerous." Miss Marple's fingers lightly traced the edges of the papers. "These contracts must be what Dawson was willing to reveal. Bristow couldn't afford to let him. But there's one thing I don't understand. Why would he leave the documents behind, knowing they could be found?" Blunt looked thoughtful. Maybe he thought it would be too late by the time anyone figured it out. Maybe he thought the papers wouldn't matter once Dawson was gone. Or perhaps, Miss Marple said slowly, he underestimated just how thorough Dawson was in preparing for his own exposure. Blunt nodded, a glimmer of realization crossing his face. So, Dawson might have known he was in danger all along. He made sure there was a record, a trail for someone to follow. "Exactly," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but decisive. "He knew that someone someday would come looking for the truth. And so he left the trail." Blunt exhaled sharply. "That would explain a lot. It also explains why Bristow has been acting so strangely. He must have known that Dawson was planning something, and he had to make sure those documents never saw the light of day." Miss Marple glanced at the papers again, her mind turning over the information. There was still one thing that bothered her, though, a nagging feeling that she couldn't quite shake. But Sergeant, what if Dawson's disappearance wasn't just about these documents? What if he was killed to protect more than just Bristow's business interests? Blunt frowned, clearly not following her train of thought. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Miss Marple said, her voice lowering with the weight of the realization. "What if Dawson knew something that no one else knew? Something that would ruin more than just Bristow's reputation? What if there's a third party involved in all of this? Someone who's been pulling the strings all along?" Blunt stared at her for a long moment, his mind clearly working through the possibilities. Finally, he spoke. "You might be right, but who could that third party be?" Miss Marple's gaze turned inward as she considered the question. There was still so much left to uncover. Dawson's death, the blackmail, the robbery. It was all starting to form a clearer picture, but it was still incomplete. The final pieces were within reach, but she needed one more breakthrough. "I believe," Miss Marple said slowly, "that we need to speak with Mrs. Henshaw again. She knows more than she's let on. I think she might hold the key to everything." Blunt looked taken aback. "Mrs. Henshaw? But she's just a widow. What does she have to do with all of this?" Miss Marple turned toward the village, her expression set. "She knows more about Dawson than anyone realizes. It's time we find out what she's been hiding." Chapter 10. The soft afternoon light filtered through the trees as Miss Marple made her way toward Mrs. Henshaw's house. The sense of unease that had gripped the village for days now seemed to weigh heavier on the older woman. Despite the outward calm, there was a stillness in the air, like the quiet before a storm. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but there was one crucial piece left unaccounted for: Mrs. Henshaw's connection to Dawson's disappearance. Miss Marple's earlier conversation with Sergeant Blunt had revealed much. They had uncovered crucial documents linking Dawson and Bristow, as well as the continuing tension between the two men. Yet, despite the evidence pointing toward a powerful motive for Bristow, something remained unresolved. Why had Dawson's disappearance gone unnoticed for so long? And why had Mrs. Henshaw been so visibly unsettled whenever Dawson's name came up? Miss Marple had long suspected that Mrs. Henshaw was holding back. Whether out of fear or loyalty, she couldn't say. But it was time to press for the truth. Dawson had known something that had put him in grave danger, and Miss Marple believed that Mrs. Henshaw had a piece of the puzzle that could expose it all. She knocked on the door of Mrs. Henshaw's cottage, her heart steady but her mind racing. The widow answered quickly, as though she had been expecting Miss Marple. There was no hesitation this time, no nervous glance over her shoulder. Mrs. Henshaw greeted her with a warm, if somewhat strained, smile. "Miss Marple, I was wondering when you would return," she said softly, stepping aside to allow the older woman into the sitting room. "Please come in." Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes briefly scanning the familiar surroundings. The room was cozy, filled with the comforting scent of fresh bread and warm wood. Mrs. Henshaw seemed composed, but there was something in her posture, something rigid in the way she stood, that caught Miss Marple's attention. She was tense, as though the weight of unspoken words were pressing down on her. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Mrs. Henshaw," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm, "but I do believe there is something you've yet to tell me." The widow stiffened slightly, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. She didn't answer immediately, and Miss Marple could see the flicker of hesitation in her eyes before she finally spoke. "I don't know what you mean," Mrs. Henshaw said, her voice a little too quiet. "I've told you everything I know." Miss Marple studied her closely, her gaze never wavering. "Have you really? Or have you been protecting someone close to you?" she asked softly. The silence that followed was thick, charged with tension. Mrs. Henshaw's face paled, and for a moment Miss Marple could see the struggle written clearly across her features. She was torn, caught between guilt and fear, between what she knew and what she had kept hidden. Finally, Mrs. Henshaw spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want you to know," she said, her eyes lowering to the floor. "I never meant for you to be involved in this, but now I see you're not going to let it go." Miss Marple remained silent, allowing Mrs. Henshaw the space to continue. She knew the widow would speak when she was ready, But Miss Marple also knew that this was the moment when the last piece of the puzzle would finally fall into place. I was involved with Dawson, Mrs. Henshaw admitted, her voice cracking slightly. Not in the way you might think, but I was part of what he was trying to hide. I didn't know at first. He kept it from me. But when I found out, I couldn't turn back. I couldn't walk away. Miss Marple's heart quickened as she took a step closer, her voice calm but insistent. "What was it, Mrs. Henshaw? What did you find out?" The widow took a deep breath, steadying herself before meeting Miss Marple's gaze. Dawson was being blackmailed. By Bristow, yes, but there was more to it. Dawson had learned something about the village, something that involved more than just Bristow's business dealings. He'd uncovered a secret that could ruin people who had the power to destroy anyone who stood in their way. Miss Marple's mind raced, but she kept her expression neutral. What secret was it, Mrs. Henshaw? What did Dawson know? Mrs. Henshaw's eyes flickered with the weight of the confession she was about to make. It wasn't just a land deal. It wasn't just money. It was something much darker. Something no one wanted to come to light. Dawson had discovered that one of the village's most respected families was involved in a crime so severe that if it was exposed, it would destroy everything. Miss Marple's pulse quickened as she thought of the implications. Which family? Who was involved? Mrs. Henshaw's face twisted with guilt. I can't say, I won't, but I will tell you this. I was trying to help Dawson. He wanted to expose it, but I begged him not to. The people involved, she stopped herself, her voice faltering. I feared for his life, and now he's gone, and I don't know what to do. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but there was a sharpness in her tone as she spoke. And Bristow, where does he fit into all of this? Mrs. Henshaw's eyes darted to the side, as though she were trying to avoid the question. Bristow, he was protecting the people involved. He was trying to cover up the crime, to make sure Dawson never told anyone. He was part of it all, Miss Marple. And now, I'm afraid he'll do anything to make sure the truth stays buried. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, her thoughts racing as she processed the new information. She had suspected there was more to the story, but now it seemed clearer than ever. Dawson's disappearance had been no random accident. It had been orchestrated to keep the darkest secrets of St. Mary Mead buried, and Bristow, it seemed, was at the heart of it all. Thank you, Mrs. Henshaw, Miss Marple said quietly, her voice steady. You've done the right thing, though it may not seem like it now. Mrs. Henshaw nodded, her face etched with regret. I only hope it's not too late. Miss Marple's eyes softened. It's never too late to uncover the truth, Mrs. Henshaw, and the truth will always find its way to the surface, no matter how deep it's buried. As Miss Marple left the widow's cottage, her mind was already turning over the new revelations. The truth about Dawson's disappearance was within reach. The final pieces were falling into place. All that remained was for her to confront Bristow and expose everything. Chapter 11. The village square was unusually quiet as Miss Marple made her way back from Mrs. Henshaw's cottage. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the cobblestones, but the air was still heavy with the anticipation of what was to come. She had known, of course, that the truth behind Dawson's disappearance was no simple matter, but the pieces she had uncovered in the past days had finally begun to form a clearer picture, one that pointed unmistakably toward Reginald Bristow. Miss Marple's thoughts swirled as she walked toward Bristow's house on the outskirts of the village. She had learned so much. The land deal, the blackmail, Dawson's discovery of a dangerous secret involving one of St. Mary Mead's most respected families. And now, Mrs. Henshaw's admission had confirmed what Miss Marple had long suspected. Bristow was involved in more than just business dealings. He was trying to protect those who had much to lose, no matter the cost. But why had Dawson been killed? Was it truly because of the land deal? Or was there something else, something even darker, that had prompted Bristow to silence him? As Miss Marple approached Bristow's house, she felt a quiet resolve settle within her. The truth was within reach, and it was time to confront the man who had been at the centre of it all. The house stood before her, imposing and somewhat out of place amidst the simple cottages of the high village. It was a large, well-maintained property, with ivy climbing the stone walls and a manicured garden that seemed to speak of wealth and power. Miss Marple rang the doorbell and waited for the inevitable. The door opened almost immediately, revealing Bristow himself, impeccably dressed as always, but with an unmistakable tightness in his demeanour. He looked at Miss Marple with a mixture of surprise and something more calculating, as if he had been expecting her visit. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with a forced smile, stepping aside to let her enter. "I wasn't expecting you. What brings you here today?" Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room as she moved toward the sitting area. "I'm afraid I have a few questions for you, Mr. Bristow," she said calmly, her voice cool and steady. "It seems there are some things about Dawson that I still don't fully understand." Bristow's expression flickered, but he quickly masked it with a practiced smile. "Dawson, you say? I'm afraid I don't know what more there is to say. The man disappeared, and that's all we know." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her gaze unwavering. "Is that really all you know, Mr. Bristow? Because I have a feeling that you know much more than you're letting on." Bristow's lips pressed together in a thin line, and for the first time Miss Marple saw a flash of something in his eyes. Something that was far from the calm indifference he usually wore. "You've been asking a lot of questions, Miss Marple. Too many, if you ask me." Miss Marple took a seat across from him, her eyes sharp and assessing. "I've learned a great deal, Mr. Bristow. About Dawson, about you, and about the people you've been protecting. But there's one thing that still doesn't make sense to me. Why did Dawson disappear? Why was he silenced?" Bristow's eyes narrowed, his fingers tightening slightly around the arm of his chair. "You're wasting your time, Miss Marple. You think you know everything, but you don't. Dawson wasn't the man you think he was." "Oh?" Miss Marple said softly, leaning forward just a fraction. "Then tell me, Mr. Bristow, what was Dawson really like? What was it that made him such a threat to you and your associates?" For a long moment there was silence. Miss Marple could see the struggle in Bristow's face as he weighed whether to admit what she already knew. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he spoke, his voice low and resigned. "Dawson wasn't just a businessman," Bristow said, his eyes avoiding hers. "He was digging into things he shouldn't have. He found out about the land deal, yes, but it was more than that. He discovered something about the people I've been protecting, something that would have ruined everything." Miss Marple's pulse quickened, but she remained calm. "And what exactly did he discover, Mr. Bristow? What was so dangerous that it had to be kept secret?" Bristow's gaze flickered to her, and for a brief moment Miss Marple could see the truth in his eyes, the guilt, the fear, the knowledge that he was cornered. "I didn't want to hurt anyone, but when Dawson found out, he became a liability. He wasn't supposed to know about the family business. about the crime that had been buried for years. And when he started asking questions, well, he trailed off, his shoulders sagging slightly. I had no choice. I had to stop him. Miss Marple's eyes locked onto his, her voice steady as she delivered the next words. So, you had him killed. You had him removed to protect yourself, and the people who would suffer if the truth came out. Bristow stiffened, but there was no denying it. The silence between them stretched, thick with the weight of the confession he had just made. Finally, he nodded, his face pale and drawn. I never wanted it to go this far, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I couldn't let him ruin everything. Not after all I've done to keep things in order. People like Dawson, they don't understand, they don't see the bigger picture. Miss Marple's voice softened, but her words were sharp. The bigger picture, Mr. Bristow? Is that what you call it? A web of lies and deceit built on the suffering of others? Bristow looked away, his face creased with regret. It's not like that, Miss Marple. You don't understand. It was never supposed to be this way. Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes narrowing slightly. It's never supposed to be this way, is it? People make choices, Mr. Bristow. And now you'll have to face the consequences of yours. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Miss Marple stood up slowly, her gaze lingering on him for one final, knowing moment. I'll be seeing you, Mr. Bristow, she said quietly, turning toward the door. The truth always comes out in the end, no matter how hard you try to hide it. As Miss Marple walked out of Bristow's house, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The mystery was nearly solved, the threads were unraveling, and soon the whole village would know the truth. Chapter 12. The wind had shifted by the time Miss Marple arrived at the village square, a brisk gust pushing the last of the evening fog into the hills. The quiet village of St. Mary Mead, which had seemed so serene and ordinary, was now a place of revelation. Secrets had been uncovered, lives had been shattered, and the truth had finally come to light. Reginald Bristow had confessed, albeit reluctantly. His involvement in Dawson's disappearance, his protection of powerful secrets, and his role in the cover-up had been made clear. But the truth was not merely about the land deals or the crime that had been buried. It was about power, greed, and the lengths people would go to preserve both. Miss Marple had left Bristow's house with a sense of finality, knowing that the most crucial pieces of the puzzle were now in place. Dawson had been murdered because he had uncovered something that threatened not just Bristow's business, but the reputations of others in the village. But there was one more person who needed to face the consequences. As Miss Marple approached the police station, she saw Sergeant Blunt standing outside, his broad shoulders squared against the wind. He turned when he saw her, his expression weary but resolute. Miss Marple, he greeted her with a nod, his voice somber. I assume you've spoken with Bristow? I have, Miss Marple replied, her voice steady but firm. And I'm afraid the truth is much darker than anyone suspected. Blunt's eyes narrowed, but there was an understanding in his gaze. It's all been leading to this. Bristow was trying to protect the families involved, but he went too far. I never thought it would come to murder. No one ever does, Miss Marple said quietly. But Bristow isn't the only one responsible. There's more to the story than even he realized. Blunt raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Miss Marple glanced toward the village square, where a few villagers still moved about, unaware of the storm that had just been weathered. There are those in this village who have more to hide than Bristow ever did. Dawson's discovery was only the beginning. The crime he uncovered wasn't just about the land deals. It was about something far worse. Blunt's frown deepened. Are you saying there are more people involved? Miss Marple nodded slowly. I believe the true mastermind behind all of this is someone who has been in plain sight the entire time. Blunt looked puzzled, but Miss Marple was already walking toward the village hall, her pace deliberate. Come with me, Sergeant, she said. It's time we brought everything into the open. Inside the village hall, Miss Marple and Blunt found Mrs. Henshaw waiting. Her face was pale, her eyes downcast, but when she saw Miss Marple enter, a flicker of something, fear perhaps, passed over her expression. Miss Marple, Mrs. Henshaw whispered, standing quickly. I didn't think it would all come out this way. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Mrs. Henshaw, there's no use hiding any longer. You know more than you've let on. And now it's time for the full truth to be revealed. The widow hesitated, her hands wringing together in a nervous gesture. I didn't want to get involved. I never meant for anyone to be hurt. Blunt stepped forward, his voice firm. Mrs. Henshaw, we know about the land deal. We know that Dawson discovered something about you, something you've been hiding. Now, it's time for you to come clean. Who else is involved in this? Mrs. Henshaw looked between them, her gaze darting toward the door as if to flee, but she remained rooted to the spot. Slowly, with a resigned sigh, she spoke. It wasn't just Bristow. It was me too. I helped cover up Dawson's discovery, but it wasn't just about the land. There's something else, something far more dangerous. My brother Harold, he's the one who's been keeping it all hidden. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. Your brother? You mean he's been involved in this crime? Mrs. Henshaw nodded, her face stricken with guilt. He's been running a network, hiding his tracks, using the land deals to cover his activities. He was involved in something far darker than anyone realized, something that could bring the whole village down if it was exposed. Blunt's face darkened. What exactly has he been involved in? Mrs. Henshaw took a shaky breath. Harold has been using his position to smuggle stolen goods through the village. High-end items, antiques, things that would raise suspicion. But he'd been careful. Too careful. Dawson uncovered the connection between the stolen goods and the land deals. That's why he was killed. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly, processing the new information. So, Dawson had discovered that your brother was the mastermind behind the illegal activities, and Bristow, wanting to protect the reputation of the village, helped cover it up. Mrs. Henshaw nodded. Yes, but Dawson wouldn't let it go. He was determined to expose everything. Harold? Harold was scared. He knew Dawson would bring the authorities into it, and that's when he made his move. Miss Marple turned to Blunt, her eyes steady. Sergeant, we need to find Harold. He's the one who pulled the strings, and he's the one who needs to answer for Dawson's death. Blunt nodded, his expression resolute. I'll organize a search right away. As they left the village hall, the weight of the truth settled in. The mystery was finally solved. And while the pieces of the puzzle had been slowly and methodically uncovered, the final revelation had been the most surprising of all. Mrs. Henshaw had been an unwitting accomplice in her brother's criminal activities, but now the truth would be known and justice would be served. The village of St. Mary Mead would never be quite the same again. The quiet, peaceful exterior had been shattered, revealing the hidden darkness that had existed beneath for so long. Yet, with the truth exposed, there was hope. The web of lies had been untangled, and the guilty would be held accountable. Miss Marple stood by the village pond once more, watching the water ripple gently in the fading light. There would be more mysteries, more secrets to uncover. But for now, she had brought justice to a village that had long lived in the shadow of its own secrets.